Hi, I'm Chandana Ekanayake, co-founder and creative director at Outerloop Games here in Seattle, Washington. Welcome to my kitchen. And my dog. Hi, Darla. Thank you for having me at GCAP. I think this year's theme, Raising the Bar, fits really well with what we're doing as a studio. Over the last year and a half, we've transitioned from a team of 7 on the first project to about a team of 15 on the current one. I want to cover why we started the studio and how the makeup of the team influences the type of games we make. Representation is one of our core values. We feel like the diverse team makeup and ideas lead to more interesting games. It's great for business and a great way to stand out in a crowded marketplace. And we're gonna do that while I attempt to make a meal. Mostly because I don't know what to do with my hands when I'm talking, so I thought I would keep my hands busy and then also have a snack once we're done with this talk. Let's see how it goes. We started Outerloop Games 4 years ago as a fully remote studio. The studio is about 15 folks and we're scattered anywhere from Seattle, Washington to Vancouver, to the UK, Toronto, East Coast of US, like New York and Virginia, and then 2 in Brisbane. We're currently in the middle of our second project, which we haven't announced yet, but we can talk about that. But before that, our first project as a studio was a game called Falcon Age. Falcon Age is a game about raising a falcon and fighting colonizers. It's a first-person action-adventure game. We originally did it as a VR game, and then during production we decided to do non-VR as well. It was a lot to take on. Probably too much to take on. I ended up doing way too many things, and I think ultimately the game was worse off for it, but we made it work. I was born in Sri Lanka, which was a British colony for about 150 years prior to getting its independence, and lived there until I was about 8. My parents were getting concerned during a civil war that had started in the early 80s. They didn't feel comfortable us being there in Sri Lanka, so we moved to the US, and my parents had to essentially restart their lives. You know, they wanted us to have a better life, so they got odd jobs and were working all the time, and you know, they tried to fit in as much as possible. While we're chatting, we're going to be making cutlets. It's a Sri Lankan savory appetizer, about the size of an egg. It's usually filled with tuna. Today we're going to use tuna and potatoes and a bunch of spices rolled in breadcrumbs, but we're going to use a cornflake crumb instead. And we'll see how it goes. All right, we're going to let these potatoes boil and then start with the next part. We have about 5 potatoes, and while they're boiling back here, let's talk about the other ingredients. There's some canned tuna, about 3 cans. This is Bumblebee light tuna chunk. We have that. We have some onion, hot chili powder, and a mixture for curry powder, salt and pepper, a couple of eggs for later, some green peppers, and some garlic. All the garlic. I think I'm gonna probably throw 12 cloves in there. All right, potatoes are boiled. We got onions in here, we got potatoes, and we're mixing it together. Onions, potatoes, some red chili pepper, and a curry mix. It's in there. We got to get some garlic in there. Whew, that onion making me tear up a little bit. Press this garlic out. When we're set, the real magical ingredient to Sri Lankan cooking is mixing it with your hands. So you gotta get your hands in there, get a nice mix in. doesn't taste the same if you don't mix it with your hand. All right, while we do this, We're going to hear from Meghna Jayanth, who is a narrative designer and writer on our current game and was on Falcon Age, and she worked on another game called 80 Days. All right.
I mean, so I think there's a really interesting through line for me from Falcon Age, which was the first time I personally have ever worked closely with someone else who's brown and South Asian on a team. And, you know, I'd been in the industry for about 8 years by that point. So that's actually pretty shocking when you think about it. I mean, I think I definitely worked on teams, like large teams where, of course, there were people of color and brown people, but I never worked closely with them on story and narrative. And I think one of the great things about that for me was the ways in which we could have conversations around all kinds of issues, and we could get into nuance because we weren't, you know, still debating the 101 and this basic idea, like, does colonialism exist? What is it? And like, why is it bad? Which, you know, I'm often brought in as a consultant on games, and particularly around like diversity and inclusion, you know, as amorphous as those ideas are. And so I often, I think I'm stuck explaining the basics to people, and that can be really helpful and useful, and I hope that's been, you know, good work. But the kind of conversations you can have, the kind of work that you can do when all of that is taken as read and you're coming from a similar basis and a similar background and experience, I think is completely different. And which was kind of, I think that's why I was really excited about working on with you and with Outerloop, because it felt like it was building on so many of the ideas and thoughts that we had on Falcon Age, but in some ways even more personal and a much more kind of character-driven story, which is something I haven't really done before. And I think would be really difficult to do outside of a team like this. I think for me, it's been really interesting to. So I think about 80 Days, which is you know, a game that I'm really proud of and I love. But in some ways, it is very much about engaging with like the white gaze on the rest of the world, and it's about, in some ways, kind of inhabiting that and deconstructing that, and kind of questioning it. But whereas I think with the really interesting thing that I've been getting to is, what are the stories that we want to tell for ourselves and for each other? And that isn't to say that, you know, like, you don't want this game and this story to be enjoyed by everyone, no matter what their background is, because actually it's a very human story in a lot of ways. You know, it's like it's a story about finding yourself, and it's a story about family and relationships and complete romantic fuck-ups, and who hasn't had those, right? But I think that this game kind of you know, I think that it's been really important to kind of spend the time thinking about this and letting it evolve. And I think it's been really difficult to get out of that feeling of like pressure and a feeling that you need to be representing things perfectly and that you need to be some kind of model minority, essentially, right? And I think as creators and artists and people working in the entertainment industry, especially marginalized people, that's a very real pressure. But I think if you kind of give into that, then you will end up making work that is, I think, less real, less personal, and kind of less true. And so I think a lot of it is also about finding that resilience within yourself to kind of trust in this specific story. And I think to balance that responsibility, I think, is a good word for it, right? Rather than pressure. And if you can convert that pressure into a sense of like responsibility and sensitivity, but not let that overwhelm you to the point that it stifles your voice in all of this, I think.
And underrepresented folks, there's a real weight and a responsibility that falls on us. because there aren't a lot of stories out there, because there is this idea that if you're from a certain country or a certain culture, a certain religion, that everyone is like that you're a monolith. Marginalized folks don't tend to get the opportunity to be individuals. They're more a part of a bigger sort of archetype. So we talk a lot about that on a daily basis and the responsibility of what that means. Here's Meghna.
It's all stuff that like you kind of wrestle with in the privacy of your own head and kind of late at night. And then you actually need to really understand, you know, who you are, where you're coming from, as well as your role as an artist, as well as like a person of color, in order to be able to kind of do this work. And I actually think that speaks to why, you know, this whole idea of like, oh, well, you know, what is the point of diversity? I think it can actually bring you qualifications to tell a story and a set of skills. I think it makes a difference in terms of craft and not just in terms of like a box ticking exercise, because these are the kinds of questions and struggles and wrestling with all of this. I feel like, you know, we've been meeting every week, Ika, pretty much for the last year and change. And we talk about this every week. Like, I think every week we have some kind of wrestle about our own personal perspective and how to put that across in the story and how that story will be perceived. And all of that is deeply informed by who we are and our identities and positions in the world, right? And I think all of that, I feel like a huge part of my job is to kind of translate all of that into the game. Yeah, I mean, and I think in some ways, you know, the story that we're telling, it does have a certain amount of like, the archetypes bring that familiarity to kind of any player. Like, you know, you've got the middle school boyfriend who's still into you, right? Like, that's kind of like a bit of an archetype, but then you find the kind of heart and soul behind that. And I've always been a believer in finding the universal through specificity. And I actually think the more kind of specific and nuanced a story is, the more it actually speaks to universal ideas. And we're making a role-playing game in a real sense, right? And part of the pleasure of that is in inhabiting someone else and living their life and their sense of being in the world. And I think that's kind of what we want to give players, this idea of being very grounded in this very specific character and her story and her personality, some of which is shaped by her culture and some of which is, you know, who she is. And we're kind of letting players be someone that they're not. And I think that's the most interesting thing.
We got to talk about spite. I joke about spite. I mean, spite has gotten me real far in my career. People telling me I can't do it, or can't do this and can't do that, or that's never been done kind of approaches. And that always gets me fired up, as it does most, I think, BIPOC folks and minorities. But spite will get you so far. Like, I think I started our studio on spite, but really, you know, the big picture is, you have to really care about what you're doing, and you have to figure out what, you know, how do you run it as a business? How do you take care of the people that work for you and work with you? What kind of stories you want to tell? What kind of legacy do you want to leave? I think all these are things that are important. Like, what are you trying to say with your game, right? Like, there's so many games you can make and so many stories you can tell. Like, what are the things that you're most excited about? And can that be a business? And that, as we're trying to grow the studio, we're at 15 now, which is probably the size we want to be at for a while. With our second game, we really thought about, like, how do we go from Falcon Age and try to grow the business and keep us afloat. How do we make something interesting that we want to make, but also how do we get it funded? How do we get it out to an audience? And part of that is figuring that out with the team and putting a pitch together and going out looking for funding. Knowing that a lot of the people that I pitched to in our last round, there was probably some odd publishers and funding options and VCs and all sorts of, platform holders, and they were mostly white male in their 30s and 40s, all except for one or two. So even though diversity is an important part of today, and people talk about it, diversity, there's still a power imbalance of what projects are getting greenlit and by who, and which is something I'd like to see change. It's something that I'm trying to do on my own to help other studios find their footing or meet the right people or figure out what kind of interesting things you can make as a pitch. The interesting thing about pitching in our last round, we had 3 game ideas. They're pretty early on, so we're like, is there a business case for any of these? So I did an initial round of pitching, went around, talked to folks. One was a little more, I guess, traditional in a sense. Second one's a little farther out there. And then the third one was, which I thought was the one I wanted to really do, but I thought was the one that people would be least interested in. But it was also the most unique one and the thing that is the least like anything else out there. And by far the best response was on the third project, which is what we took that information, built a demo, and then pitched for real to find a publisher and find a partner. And we're lucky enough to land Annapurna, who believe in the project and believe in us, and they've been great partners. There's one question that come up recently with in our studio, which is, when was the first time you remember being seen? As in, when was the first time you felt represented in a game or in a movie or a TV show? And we talked with a couple folks, and first one we're going to talk to is Emma Kosh. She's in Brisbane. She's our character artist, just an amazingly talented character artist and just a great person. So let's talk to Emma.
I think for the most, the lightning bolt moment of, oh my God, that's me, or that's how I feel, or have experienced the world, which was when I was watching Gentleman Jack, which is that a historical drama based on a real 200-year-old lesbian from the UK. And just when she's talking about her life, how others perceive her, how she feels internally about herself, because she detailed everything in these diaries, so we can read all back through what she said. And it's just so crazy how much of it is how 200 years later a young gay woman might feel almost identical to this woman who lived 200 years ago. I just found that really crazy. Never really felt that before. So, and that's the feeling, right? You may not have known that you were being excluded in representation until you've felt it for the first time, hit you like that bolt of lightning. Oh my God, I didn't know I was missing out on this sort of thing. And that's a really startling revelation. Well, it was for me at least. And now that's sort of made me go, damn, I was just sort of tolerating whatever type of representation was being manifested in the past. It's not like growing up there was no, same-sex women representation. There was, but it wasn't great. And it was always very stereotypical, which is probably similar to how a lot of people experience this type of, representation, as some say it already exists, but it's just a stereotyped example of someone's life or experience, or how they're perceived by the rest of the world. And it wasn't until it was the other way round, where it was oh, this is actually an individual describing their experience in their life, instead of it being kind of projected onto them by a status quo or something, that it was revealing how little of that had existed up until that point.
I feel like there's a lot of stories out there, and there's a lot of stories that are underrepresented, and that's part of why we started the studio and what we do Falcon Age, and who we hired for our next game. The thing about being seen, listen, we can empathize with people and characters that are different than us. I grew up in the US. Most of the media is white focused and white characters, and guess what? I can still get into those kind of stories. So I think, I feel confident that even though we're making a game about South Asian culture and different diversities, it's still a relationship and a people story. And I think, same way that I can identify with people that are not like me, I think other people can also. And I think that's really important, that you can tell those stories and get it out to an audience.
No, absolutely. And I think, games are an act of speculation, right? And as is all fiction. And actually that, I love fantasy and sci-fi. And a lot of that is grounded in very different cultures, very different ideas. And, when you read a great fantasy novel and you enter another world, there's a great kind of pleasure in that. And I think it's really interesting that for us, from where we're coming from, we're making this game that it kind of simultaneously, we want it to feel very familiar to immigrants and people of color and particularly like South Asians, so that they can see themselves. But I think it's also a very enjoyable act of like speculation and fantasy for anyone else, come be part of this. I mean, if you've ever been to an Indian wedding, you know what that's like. It's this kind of joyful, very generous, very celebratory event that you're kind of invited into. And I think, it's the same pleasure of travel, isn't it? Right? Like being invited, traveling with someone from that culture, right? And if they get to show you their hometown, and you kind of get to like experience it with them, with that insider knowledge. And I think that's where we're aiming for with.
I don't know if I quite thought this all the way through logistically, but hey, you're here, I'm here, we're here. We'll just finish it, right? All right, so continuing on, we have some green peppers we're gonna cut up and throw in there to the mix. One of the more recent hires we've made is Sunny Dubé. She's South African. She lives in Toronto, and this is our first project. So let's hear from Sunny.
Well, my expectations, like going into working into the game industry, I was like, wow, this is going to be fun. But I also started at the time where everything was getting really controversial everywhere. So I was like, is this still going to be fun? And then I actually started like working here, and it was super fun. And I'm having so much, well, I can't keep using the word fun, but I'm having like such a good time, and I really like working with everybody here. And I think part of that is because it's such a diverse studio that I don't really feel boxed in by trying to have to conform to like a specific group of people's identity. So yeah, this is going very, very well.
So as we're working on this new game, one of the things, we're doing a lot of research on various tech. It's a stylized game, but we're doing a lot of darker skinned characters, and how do we render that the best? And as we're looking at examples and research, find out that, technology is biased. We knew that, but a lot of the examples out there for usually white or lighter skinned characters, when you're trying to do type 3 or type 4 type hair, there isn't a lot of examples out there. Here's Sunny to talk about that.
The first time that I felt seen was when Zazie Beetz played Domino in Deadpool 2, because that was an experience where it's like, oh my gosh, is that a person with 4C hair? She doesn't have to I don't think she has 4C hair, but type 4 hair. She doesn't have to do anything with it. Wow, that's amazing. We're progressing. And not only that, it's the main character. And her whole identity isn't built around being black, because I think that's what happens in a lot of film, which makes it kind of unrelatable, is that the character's whole identity is built around being black, and now we just have this cool superhero character in this R-rated movie, and it's just a lot of fun to watch. And then she did such a good job, regardless of people just being why did they have to make her black? And she was the best person for the role. So that's the first time that I felt seen. and which leads into like the games industry, right? Because a lot of times in a lot of games there's like the afro hairstyle, which is just kind of like easy, simple. It's a circle with a little bit of texture and that's it. And that's good and fine, but there's a lot more to black hairstyles than just afro. And, you know, looking at the curly styles and how now there's hardly any examples of it that exist. And like the best example we have right now is from a game that is postponed indefinitely, basically cancelled, which is like tough. And I'm really happy that like we're working towards that on this game, that we could like bring it forward, like bring in like a type like a tighter type 3 or a looser type 4 hair texture in there to bring in something different rather than just like straight hair, like just a regular straight hair kind of appearance. Talking about it in general, I think like having such a diverse cast in this kind of game is like really interesting, because in these genres it's usually just a bunch of like not to be like not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but there is kind of something inherently wrong. It's usually kind of just the same cardboard cutout hot person who is more than likely of European descent, and that eventually starts to get boring. So I like that we're trying to like that we are actually bringing in all of these people from all of these different backgrounds and bringing in our own personal experiences, and not just doing it in a way that's kind of like diversity for diversity's sake, because I think that that's starting to happen a lot, that we're actually taking the time to think about where these characters are from, what their personal history is, and you're not like in the case of this character, not just saying that, oh, this person is from South Africa, saying that, no, this person is from a specific group within South Africa, which is something that's very different, because it's not like all of these countries have one culture. A lot of countries are built up of a lot of cultures. So I think that's how I feel about it.
But it's such a great project, and it's so interesting that I've had such an opportunity to make such stuff that I don't think in a million years I would have been able to get a chance to do just with my own hands, kind of thing. Like so many different types of characters and people that I've never even seen like the other character artists that I've worked with in the past make themselves in all the time that they were doing their projects. So I feel really thankful and lucky that I've been able to work on something that is what it is. It's nice. It's refreshing. It's so refreshing.
Gosh, it upsets me like beyond anything, just because there are so many countries in Africa with so many different cultures, and I feel like people also forget that like North Africa is a thing that exists. Like Egypt is part of Africa, you know, but even moving away from that, like just the whole idea that, oh my gosh, African aesthetic, kente cloth, animal skin print. Ooh, we're doing it. This is amazing. This is the best thing we've ever done. Representation, everyone. And I think like the biggest example of this sometimes, like the generalization of African culture and like the really like just treating Africa as like a country, was in, I forgot which Avengers movie it was, but they closed off the streets in Johannesburg to like film like the big scene where like the big Hulkbuster scene and all of that. And then they had the audacity to not even like pretend, not even to say that it wasn't like another country, just call it African coast. What is African coast? There's not a country called African coast, so that implies that they're just saying that on the coast of Africa. Which country in Africa? I would like to know, please. So it's just kind of like the generalization of Africa is like really annoying, and I wish people would just kind of take the time to just understand the different cultures that are there, and that, like, you know, West African culture is a lot different than Sub-Saharan African culture, which is a lot different than East African culture. And realize that there's so much that Africa has to offer if you stop seeing it as like a big monolith of people who are, you know, less fortunate than you. Because I feel like, coming from like a privileged perspective, most people just view Africa as a place where like the less fortunate live. So I think people should take it a little bit more seriously, a lot more seriously, actually.
Whether you're cooking a great meal with a variety of ingredients or putting together a game with some diverse collaborators, there's always something exciting about that process and how you put that together. We're firm believers in designing a game with your team and their superpowers. Well, let's see how it turned out. It's good. It's good. It's not as good as my mom's, but it's good. Thank you for joining us. I hope you learned a little bit about cutlets and Sri Lankan food, a little bit about our team, and how we go about raising the bar. Thank you for having me at GCAP. The work that's coming out of the Australian game development scene is really inspiring. There's so much talent. I'm excited for what's to come. Paul? Other Paul. Okay, sit.